Dr. Nancy Perrin, a professor and director of biostatistics and methods at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. Nancy has worked in conflict settings in sub-Saharan Africa to develop norms measures for violence against women and children. And today she'll be presenting to us her experiences and findings in choosing items for a social norm scale to measure norms reinforcing or protecting against transactional sex in Rio. So Nancy, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Brian. So we'll wait for the slides to come up. There we go. All right, I think we can go to the next slide. So we are going to be talking today about measuring social norms and attitudes around age-disparate transactional sex. Next slide, please. And this project was done in collaboration with Promundo, Rio de Janeiro, Washington, D.C., and also the London School and with Johns Hopkins. Next slide, please. So age-disparate transactional sex occurs between girls less than 18 years old and adult men at least 10 years older. It has negative health and psychosocial consequences, including increased risk for HIV and STI, increased risk for intimate partner violence, and it comes with stigma and from the community. And we know that social norms influence age-disparate transactional sex, and so interventions may want to use a social norms approach. Next slide, please. And towards that end, the aims of this study was to create a measure of communities' norms and attitudes towards transactional sex that can be used to evaluate future social norms interventions. Importantly, we wanted to be able to directly compare social norms and attitudes to help understand the process of change. Therefore, we developed two sets of items, parallel items for community norms and separately for attitudes, evaluated the construct, validity, and reliability of those two sets of items, and examined the concurrent validity. And those results are what I'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. The context for the study are favelas in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. These are socially and economically vulnerable communities that have rudimentary infrastructure. There's high crime and drug activity, and many of them are ruled by drug lords. And there is at least a 14% prevalence of adult men engaged in age-disparate transactional sex. Next slide, please. So we began by generating items, which was based on previous qualitative work. The team in Rio wrote the items based on interviews and going through those transcripts and the analyses of those transcripts. And then the larger team classified the items into different domains. The domains that consistently emerged were girls' motivations for engaging in age-disparate transactional sex, girls' readiness for sex and their agency, and men's motivation for engaging in transactional sex. We created two versions of these. One, the attitudes used the STEM in your opinion, and for social norms, we use the STEM in the opinion of residents of your community. And they were both on 5-point Likert scales of strongly disagree to agree. Next slide, please. So we began with 71 items. Really the start was to generate as many items as we could. We weren't worrying about redundant items at this point in time. We sent those 71 items out for expert review with 14 experts, asking them to rate the relevance, clarity, and importance of the items. From there, a content validity coefficient was computed for each item, and we used those to decide on which items to retain based on the value of the content validity index and which items to exclude or revise. We also used those to help us choose among redundant items, selecting the one with the highest content validity coefficient. After that process, we had 42 items that were pre-tested with 17 participants. At this stage, and based on their feedback, we dropped items related to drug trafficking, which were very specific to the context that we were looking at and kind of off the topic of transactional sex. And then we selected among items that were perceived as highly similar, which gave us 31 items that were moved into the psychometric study, which included 431. And in the end, we ended up with 13 items, and I'll talk a little bit about that process now. Next slide, please. In the psychometric study, we selected communities according to their geographical location and their social vulnerability index. In the end, there were 3 locations in the Rio and the surrounding area. We used a multi-stage sampling plan and randomly selected 23 census tracts. Next slide, please. The sample, as I mentioned, had 431 individuals. Half of them were females by design in the sampling frame. 1/3 were teens, 15 to 17, 1/3 young adults, 18 to 24, and 1/3 25 and older, also by design in the sampling frame. 45% described their position in the household as a child or stepchild, and 38 as head of the household. 39% had not completed primary school, and another 36.6 had not completed secondary school. Next slide, please. So the factor analysis process first examined all of the 31 items separately for attitudes, this attitude set of items, and then again for the social norm set of items. We conducted a factor analysis and retained the items in each set that had sufficient variance explained by the common factors based on the communalities, which led us to 24 attitude items and 23 social norms items. And then we identified the items that were in common to both of those 2 sets, which led us to 15 items that had both attitudes or personal beliefs and social norms. Next slide, please. In those factor analyses of those 15 items, 3 factors emerged based on the eigenvalues and the interpretation. 2 of the items did not load on any of the factors for attitudes, and those same 2 items had low factor loadings on the social norm set, and so were dropped. The final factor analysis of 13 items had 3 factors with good simple structure. In other words, each item loaded high on one and only one factor and low on the others. All the factor loadings were greater than 0.35 for attitudes, greater than 0.45 for social norms. And so the social norms set explained more variance than the attitudes. Next slide, please. So let's talk about these 3 subscales that came out. The first were attributions to girls' behavior, which had 5 items. And this set captures girls' reasons for engaging in transactional sex, things like protection and financial stability, as well as the process related to engaging in transactional sex, spending a lot of time on the street, responding to men's advances, and wearing short skirts. In both sets, attitudes and social norms, these 5 items had good internal consistent reliability, as seen here with the convex alpha. Next slide, please. The next factor were men's motivations, and it also contained 5 items. These items reflect the role of men's power and pleasure for engaging in transactional sex. These also had acceptable convex alphas for both the set of attitude items and the set of social norms items. Next slide, please. And the final factor had 3 items and was girls' readiness to have sex, which reflects the stage of development of a girl's body and her age in the relationship to being ready to have sex. Interesting, the social norm had much better internal consistency, reliability, 0.83, than attitudes, which was substantially lower at 0.59. This may reflect some inconsistency in people's attitudes, where they also see a stronger, more consistent social norm. Next slide, please. All right, so we tested for differences in attitudes versus social norms, and in general, people's Attitudes were more positive than their social norms for attributions to girls' behavior and for girls' readiness to have sex, but there was no difference in the strength of attitudes or social norms for men's motivation. Next slide, please. We hypothesized that there would be differences by gender, and in fact, we did find them. Next slide, please. And those differences by gender, we found that women were less likely to make attributions to girls' behavior, both in attitudes and how they perceive the social norms. There are no differences, once again, for men's motivation, and women were less likely to say that young girls are ready to have sex than men are, and the social norm also paralleled that. Next slide, please. We also examined differences by age, which once again, we found several differences. Next slide, please. In terms of attributions to girls' behavior, younger people see the community making more attributions to girls' behavior than the older age groups. So the younger saw more of that for the social norms, but not for the attitudes. In terms of men's motivations, younger age groups were more likely to see men as motivated to have transactional sex than the older groups, and the social norm also paralleled that. Girls ready to have sex, younger were more likely to see girls as ready to have sex, and same with the social norm. Finally, next slide, please. Finally, we also saw differences by those who had engaged in transactional sex. Next slide, please. With those who have engaged being more likely to make attributions to girls' behavior, more likely to see men as having stronger motivation to have transactional sex, and more likely to see girls as being ready at a young age to have sex, but less likely to see the community have that perception. Next slide. So to conclude, we were able to find 3 subscales to measure girl attitudes and norms towards age-disparate transactional sex. Personal attitudes are more positive than social norms, which make this area may be ready for social norms interventions. Men's motivations seem to be more entrenched with no differences between personal attitudes and social norms. There's good psychometric properties of the scales except for the internal consistency for the girl's readiness to have sex attitude. And importantly, the scales don't exhibit ceiling effects, which make them promising to be sensitive to change in evaluation for social norms interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for your description of your rather rigorous process of scale development relating to social norms. We wish we had a lot more time to look at some of those details, and it's really great to see this recent proliferation of validated scales. And we're going to move on to our third panelist. We have the pleasure of Dr. Cari Jo Clark, an associate professor at Emory's Rollins School of Public Health. She's currently working in 3 ongoing evaluations in Nepal, investigating the impact of social norms on child marriage, school retention, and gender-based violence. And today she'll be sharing with us the development and measurement properties of the intimate partner violence help-seeking norm scale. Cari, you're up next.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Brian. I am so happy to follow Nancy because she did things in the right order. And I will talk about having to measure something that we don't have a scale for, but doing it live without any opportunity to do all the formal testing that one would like to have. And I'm sure many of us in the room, the electronic room, probably have the exact same scenario in terms of timeframes that are incredibly short and funding that doesn't allow for super formal measurement work. But that doesn't mean we can't do it and do our best and take advantage of the opportunities that we have. So it's probably a little too early to give this a name, but I went ahead and named it with the aspiration that by the end of the project, we will have a well-validated scale. So in terms of help seeking, which is the primary, sorry, I'm changing my own scales and I need to tell you to please change my scale, my slide. I'm like 1 or 2 slides ahead of you. This is good. Okay, so help seeking is a very important variable. We know that all over the world, most women don't seek help, and when they do seek help, it is to informal sources, family, friends, neighbors. Here you have Nepal highlighted that little black line there. So point number 4, I found myself evaluating a project. It's a multi-component, multi-stakeholder intervention designed to break silence around gender-based violence, especially intimate partner violence, but also other forms of gender-based violence. So the overall aim of my presentation today is to describe the development and measurement properties of this help-seeking scale, which we were able to collect data in 2018 as part of this baseline assessment for the Sahaj project, which, next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit about the context of the project. So this is a project as part of a larger consortium funded by DFID around security and justice reforms, with this particular project strengthening access to holistic, gender responsive and accountable justice in Nepal, or Sahaj, was designed to incorporate these various elements. A family-centered model, which a good part of it was tested during the What Works consortium. School-centered approach, where they worked a lot with youth clubs and school management committees to try to change norms around breaking the silence and encouraging help-seeking, as well as a grassroots accountability approach, which is a security and justice oriented approach, but with a strong emphasis on linking the communities and security and justice providers to have a more accountable, more community-centered approach to addressing issues of trust and accountability to the population, to the community. So these 3 approaches are working simultaneously. Next slide, please. For our project, similar in some ways to what Nancy was mentioning, we have our basic item development. But opposite of what Nancy was mentioning is that we did not have the opportunity to do all of our formative work beforehand. We ended up having to do it concurrently with our baseline assessment. So we needed to conduct a census in order to do sampling. So we were able to draft some items or use existing scales where possible and put it into the census. And I'll talk about that in just 1 second. This census was done in about 3,500 households in 17 communities in 2 provinces. That's province number 2 and 5 in Nepal. I will take you through some of the measurement and variance testing through a quantitative approach, and then talk a little bit more about our qualitative data and our next steps based on the quantitative and the qualitative findings. Next slide, please. When we were trying to understand social norms around help seeking for gender-based violence, we identified 3 different models. And you see here, those models are listed on the slide here. A little bit of a challenge with the models is they're mostly developed in Western settings or with immigrant populations to the US. I think there is a lot of commonalities in terms of the constructs there, but that's really where we were starting, is trying to understand lacking strong frameworks for lower and middle income countries, in our particular case, Nepal. But what we were able to cull from these different frameworks is several sociocultural phenomena or constructs that were related to women's propensity to seek help for gender-based violence. And you see them here, really women's status and their identity as a woman based on her marital status and status within the family, the acceptability and normalization of violence, family and community cohesion, and really the collectivist nature of many of the societies that we all work in, the concepts of honor and stigma in terms of the importance of maintaining those, and the role of help seeking in dishonoring the family or generating stigma, and victim blaming in terms of the scenarios under which a woman might be considered to be the one who caused the violence in the first place or who is at fault. Next slide, please. So you see here our items and their frequencies. We followed a model from a scale that we developed through another What Works project, the Change Starts at Home project. And there we also had to develop a scale, which is the partner violence norm scale, and we were able to validate it through that project. So a number of our items we utilized from that scale because it was developed in Nepal, validated in Nepal, and seemed to have been working pretty well to examine change over time, which is one of the things that is critically missing from many of the scales that are used more for observational purposes or cross-sectional purposes. So you see the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 listed here are related to stem from the partner violence norm scale. There were some items that we had to, that different team members proposed based on their experience thus far in the project and with prior projects in Nepal. And there were other items that we were required to have because they're part of the larger consortium monitoring and learning plan. And here you see in terms of their distribution, they all have a nice sort of normal distribution, and we have a reasonable amount of percentage of responses, and the actual total is also the underlying ends for each of these items is strong. So you see that we're covering all of the response options, and they all have quite a nice little normal distribution. Next slide, please. First step in our measurement and variance testing was to do an EFA and a CFA approach. So we used a split half random sample and ran a series of EFA models, exploratory factor analysis. We tried to do 1 to 3, only 1 would be extracted. And as you can see here, for province 2 and 5, we have strong fitting models in both. And here on the right side, you can see the fit thresholds. Using the second split random half, we did a CFA. Also, we have strong fit. When we look at the CAS disadvantaged and advantaged, because if we want to make comparisons across these different variables, we need to be able to show that there's non-invariance across these different characteristics. And again, we have strong fitting EFAs and CFAs. CFA would be the same as the province. Next slide, please. When we look at our step 2 of the measurement non-invariance testing, which are multi-group confirmatory factor analyses, the first one is by province and the second one is by CAST. You see, in terms of the model fit, there is a little bit of suggestion that it is not completely measurement non-invariant by province. I've investigated that further. It's not extreme, but it is something to note and something to refine further in our, as we move forward. And by CAST, the models fit quite nicely. And here on the left, you can see the distributions are as we would expect. In terms of province 5 is the one that has much more egalitarian norms. And in terms of our advantaged or disadvantaged CAST, the advantaged CAST we have consistently found to have slightly higher norms. Next slide. When we look at our qualitative data, because we have over 80 transcripts that we have been working through, and I don't have time to go through all of these, but there are a number of constructs that link closely also with the frameworks. So we have the opportunity to improve the scale. Thank you very much.